The desert sun beat down mercilessly as Hannah Dawson stumbled forward, each step heavier than the last. Her parched lips cracked and bleeding as she pushed herself beyond human endurance. She had been walking for 3 days with barely any water, her supplies having run out shortly after her wagon had broken down miles back. The rolling hills of the Arizona Territory seemed endless, each rise promising salvation only to reveal more desolate landscape beyond. Hannah's vision blurred as Jerome Junction shimmered like a mirage in the distance. She had heard of the small settlement that had sprung up around the railroad junction, a lifeline in this harsh territory, but it seemed impossibly far away. The hem of her once fine dress was tattered and dusty, her hands raw from clutching her small bundle of remaining possessions. At 22, Hannah had never imagined she would die alone in the wilderness, fleeing from a past that haunted her every step. Just a little further, she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible even to her own ears. The fence line of a modest cattle ranch appeared before her, the wooden posts standing like sentinels against the harsh landscape. Beyond it stood a simple but sturdy homestead, smoke curling from its chimney. Hope flared briefly in Hannah's chest before darkness crept in from the edges of her vision. Her knees buckled beneath her, the world tilting violently as she collapsed onto the sun-baked earth, unconscious before she even hit the ground. Colton Forrester was checking his fence line when he spotted the figure in the distance, moving slowly, unsteadily toward his property. Living alone for 5 years, since establishing his ranch outside Jerome Junction, had made him cautious of strangers, but something about the way this one moved, stumbling, desperate, told him this wasn't a threat but someone in dire need. He mounted his horse and rode out toward the boundary of his land, dust kicking up behind him. As he drew closer, he realized it was a woman, and she was in bad shape. Just as he approached, she crumpled to the ground like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Colton dismounted in a fluid motion, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the hard earth. He knelt beside her, gently turning her over. Her face was streaked with dust and sweat, her skin hot to the touch. Dehydration and heat exhaustion, he figured, having seen it before in these parts. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with chestnut hair that might have been lovely if not matted with dust and sweat. "Miss, can you hear me?" he asked, knowing she was too far gone to respond. Making a quick decision, Colton gathered her limp form into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her body frail from what must have been a long journey. He carefully lifted her onto his horse, then mounted behind her, one strong arm holding her securely against his chest as he guided his mount back toward the homestead. The woman stirred slightly as they approached his cabin, a soft moan escaping her lips, but she didn't regain consciousness. Colton's mind raced with questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? What had driven her to walk until she collapsed from exhaustion? But those questions would have to wait. Right now, she needed water, shade, and rest. As he carried her into his modest home, Colton had no way of knowing that this moment would change the course of his life forever. He laid her gently on his bed, the only proper place for her to recover, and set about the task of saving her life, never once considering asking her to leave once she was well enough to go. Hannah's consciousness returned slowly, like a swimmer rising from deep water. First came awareness of softness beneath her, a real bed, not the hard ground. Then the blessed relief of shade and cool air against her skin. Finally, she registered the sensation of dampness on her forehead, a cool cloth being gently pressed against her burning skin. Her eyes fluttered open to see a rough-hewn wooden ceiling above her. Confusion gripped her as she tried to piece together where she was and how she had gotten here. The last thing she remembered was walking, endlessly walking toward what she hoped was civilization. "Easy now," came a deep, gentle voice from beside her. "You're safe." Hannah turned her head slightly, wincing at the pain the movement caused to see a man sitting beside the bed. He was perhaps in his late 20s, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of the Arizona sky. His dark hair was slightly too long, as if he hadn't bothered to cut it in some time, and a few days' worth of stubble darkened his jaw. "Water," she managed to croak, her throat feeling like sandpaper. The man reached for a cup on the bedside table. "Small sips," he instructed, supporting her head as he held the cup to her lips. "Too much at once will make you sick." The water was cool and sweet, the most wonderful thing Hannah had ever tasted. She wanted to gulp it down, but the man was firm, allowing her only small sips before pulling the cup away. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice slightly stronger. "My ranch, about 2 miles outside Jerome Junction, Arizona Territory," he replied. "I found you collapsed at the edge of my property. You've been unconscious for nearly a day." Hannah tried to sit up but found she lacked the strength. "I need to get to town," she said urgently. "Not yet, you don't," he replied, his tone brooking no argument. "You're suffering from heat exhaustion and dehydration. You need rest." "I can't impose, it's no imposition," he said firmly. "I'm Colton Forrester. This is my ranch." Hannah hesitated, years of caution making her wary of giving her real name, but something in the man's steady gaze made her reconsider. "Hannah," she said finally. "Hannah Dawson." "Well, Miss Dawson, you're welcome to stay here until you're well enough to travel. I've tended to sick cattle and horses before. Humans aren't so different when it comes to needing rest and care." Despite her situation, Hannah found herself smiling slightly at his matter-of-fact tone. "Thank you, Mr. Forrester. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." A shadow crossed his face. "No need to think about that. You're here now and you're going to be fine." Over the next few days, Hannah drifted in and out of consciousness as her body recovered from the ordeal. Each time she woke, Colton was nearby, offering water or simple broth, changing the cool cloth on her forehead, or simply sitting beside her reading by lamplight. He asked no questions about why she was traveling alone or what had brought her to this remote part of the territory, and Hannah was grateful for his discretion. On the third day, she woke feeling significantly stronger. Sunlight streamed through the window, and for the first time she took proper stock of her surroundings. The room was simple but clean, with practical furniture that had clearly been built by hand. A small bookshelf stood against one wall, filled with well-worn volumes. Through the open door, she could see a modest main room with a stone fireplace. Hannah sat up cautiously, pleased to find the room no longer spun when she moved. She was wearing a man's shirt that hung loosely on her frame. Someone had changed her out of her filthy dress, though she tried not to think too much about that. Footsteps approached, and Colton appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray. He stopped short when he saw her sitting up. "You're looking better," he observed, a smile warming his features. "I feel better," Hannah admitted, "though I'm still a bit weak." "That'll pass," he said, setting the tray beside her. It held a bowl of what looked like stew, a chunk of bread, and more water. "Think you can manage real food today?" Hannah's stomach growled audibly in response, causing a blush to spread across her cheeks. Colton chuckled. "I'll take that as a yes." He settled into the chair beside the bed. "Go ahead. It's not fancy cooking, but it'll put strength back in your bones." Hannah took a tentative spoonful of the stew, then another more eagerly. It was simple fare: beef, potatoes, and carrots in a rich broth, but to her, it tasted like heaven. "This is wonderful," she said between bites. "You're quite the cook, Mr. Forrester." "Colton," he corrected. "And when you live alone, you either learn to cook or you eat poorly." Hannah nodded, understanding all too well the necessity of self-reliance. As she ate, she took the opportunity to study her rescuer more carefully. He was tall and lean, but with the wiry strength that came from physical labor rather than idleness. His hands were calloused, his skin weathered by sun and wind, but there was a gentleness to his movements that belied his rugged appearance. "I've been meaning to ask," she said hesitantly, "where have you been sleeping? I seem to have taken your bed." "I've got a bedroll by the fire," he said with a shrug. "I've slept in worse places." Guilt flashed across Hannah's face. "I can't put you out of your own bed." "You're not putting me anywhere," Colton interrupted. "I made the choice, and it's temporary." There was an awkward silence as Hannah finished her meal, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the soft whistle of wind around the cabin's eaves. "I should be able to travel soon," Hannah said finally, setting aside her empty bowl. "Perhaps tomorrow or the next day." Colton's expression remained neutral, though something flickered in his eyes. "There's no rush," he said. "Jerome Junction isn't going anywhere, and neither are you until you're properly recovered." "That's very kind, but I've imposed enough. Besides, I need to find work." "I can't," she stopped abruptly, not wanting to admit the full extent of her desperate situation. "What kind of work were you looking for?" Colton asked, seemingly casual, though his eyes were sharp with interest. Hannah hesitated. "Anything respectable. I can read and write, keep accounts. I worked as a seamstress back in," she caught herself. "Back where I came from." Colton nodded thoughtfully. "Jerome Junction's growing since the railroad came through, but it's still a small town. Jobs for women are limited." He paused. "I could use some help around here, though, just until you're on your feet properly." Hannah looked at him suspiciously. "What kind of help?" "Nothing improper," he said quickly, a slight flush rising on his tanned cheeks. "It's just that spring roundup is coming, and I'll be busy with the cattle. The garden needs tending, there's mending to be done, and frankly, I wouldn't mind eating something other than my own cooking for a change." Hannah considered the offer. It would give her time to regain her strength fully and perhaps save a little money before venturing into the unknown of Jerome Junction. Still, she was wary. "I wouldn't feel right not paying my way," she said finally. "Room and board plus a small wage," Colton offered. "Just until you decide what you want to do next." Something in his words, the implicit understanding that her presence here was temporary, that she would eventually move on, both reassured and, unexpectedly, disappointed Hannah. "All right," she agreed, "but only until I'm fully recovered and have enough saved for a proper start in town." Colton nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "That's settled then." He stood, collecting the empty tray. "Rest today. Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, I'll show you around the place." After he left, Hannah sank back against the pillows, her mind whirling with thoughts. She had left St. Louis with barely enough money for her journey west, fleeing a situation that had become increasingly dangerous. The broken-down wagon and theft of her remaining funds by a supposed helpful traveler had left her with nothing but the clothes on her back, and the small bundle of personal items she'd managed to save now somewhere on Colton's property, she presumed. Yet despite the precariousness of her situation, Hannah felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: safe. There was something about Colton Forrester, his quiet strength, his lack of prying questions, the simple decency with which he'd treated her, that inspired trust. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew. Trust had betrayed her before. But as she drifted back to sleep, Hannah couldn't help but think that perhaps, just this once, her instincts might be right. True to his word, Colton showed Hannah around his property the following day. It was modest by ranching standards: 100 head of cattle, a small herd of horses, a few chickens, and a vegetable garden that had clearly seen better days. I'm not much of a gardener, Colton admitted as they stood looking at the neglected plot. The previous owner's wife had it thriving, but I've been lucky to get a few potatoes and carrots each season. Hannah surveyed the overgrown beds with a professional eye. It has potential, she said. Good soil from the look of it. With some work, you could have fresh vegetables all summer and plenty to preserve for winter. Colton looked at her with new respect. You know about gardening, Hannah nodded. My mother kept a kitchen garden. She taught me. The mention of her mother brought a fleeting sadness to her eyes that she quickly masked. I can have this cleaned up and planted within a week, weather permitting. I'd appreciate that, Colton said sincerely. Fresh greens would be a welcome change. He showed her the rest of the homestead, the barn where he kept his horses and tools, the chicken coop where a dozen hens scratched and clucked, the smokehouse where he preserved meat for the winter months. It was all simple but well maintained, the work of a man who took pride in what he'd built. How long have you been here? Hannah asked as they walked back toward the cabin. 5 years, Colton replied. Came west after the war with what little I had and staked my claim. Started with 10 head of cattle and built from there. Hannah did the mental calculation. If Colton had fought in the Civil War and come west afterward, he must be at least in his early 30s, older than she'd initially thought. You've done well for yourself, she observed. Colton shrugged modestly. I get by. It's a good life if a bit solitary at times. He glanced at her. What about you? What brings a young woman all the way out here alone? Hannah tensed, the question she'd been dreading finally spoken aloud. I needed a fresh start, she said carefully. St. Louis had too many memories. Colton nodded, not pressing further. The West is good for fresh starts. Nobody asks too many questions about what came before. Relief washed over Hannah at his understanding. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For not asking questions. Colton's gaze was steady. Your past is your own, Miss Dawson. If you ever want to share it, I'm willing to listen. If not, that's your choice. They had reached the cabin, and Hannah paused on the porch, looking back at the expanse of land that stretched toward distant mountains. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over everything, making even the dusty yard look beautiful. It's peaceful here, she said, almost to herself. That it is, Colton agreed. That it is. Over the next few weeks, a routine developed. Hannah, growing stronger each day, took charge of the domestic aspects of ranch life. She tackled the garden first, clearing away weeds and dead plants, turning the soil, and planting seeds Colton purchased on his next trip to town. She reorganized the cabin, cleaned it thoroughly, and began making small improvements, curtains from spare fabric she found in a trunk, wildflowers in tin cans on the table, arrangements that made the simple dwelling feel more like a home. Colton, busy with spring roundup and branding, would leave at dawn and return exhausted at dusk to find hot meals, clean clothes, and increasingly pleasant conversation. Hannah proved to be not only capable but educated, able to discuss the few books on his shelf and eager to hear news of the world beyond the ranch. They maintained a careful propriety. Hannah continued to sleep in the bedroom while Colton made do with his bedroll by the fire, despite her protests. They never discussed how long she might stay beyond vague references to "when you go to town," which somehow kept getting postponed. One evening in late April, after a particularly grueling day, Colton returned to find Hannah singing softly to herself as she kneaded bread dough. The sound stopped him in his tracks. Her voice was clear and sweet, the melody unfamiliar but haunting. He stood in the doorway, unwilling to interrupt and break the spell. When she finally noticed him, Hannah jumped, her cheeks flushing. I didn't hear you come in, she said, wiping flour from her hands. Don't stop on my account, Colton said. It's been a long time since I've heard singing in this house. Hannah smiled shyly. My father used to say I sang before I could talk. It became a habit when I'm working. Your father had good ears, Colton observed, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. That was beautiful. Thank you. Hannah returned to her kneading, the flush still evident on her cheeks. There's water heating for you to wash up. Dinner will be ready soon, beef stew and fresh bread. Sounds like heaven, Colton said, moving to the basin she'd prepared. As he washed away the dust and sweat of the day, he watched Hannah from the corner of his eye. She moved with a natural grace around the kitchen, at ease in a way she hadn't been when she first arrived. I found your bundle, he said casually. The one you were carrying when you collapsed. It's on the chair in the bedroom. Hannah's hand stilled momentarily. Thank you, she said, her voice carefully neutral. I'd wondered what had happened to it. I didn't look inside, Colton assured her. Figured whatever you were carrying was your business. Hannah nodded gratefully, resuming her work with the dough. After placing the loaf in the oven, she wiped her hands and excused herself to the bedroom, returning moments later with a small leather-bound book. My journal, she explained, holding it up. The only thing of real value I had with me. Well, that and this. She touched a small silver locket that hung around her neck, previously hidden beneath her high-collared dress. Family, Colton asked, gesturing to the locket. My mother, Hannah confirmed. She died when I was 16. It has a small portrait of her inside. May I? Colton asked, extending his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Hannah nodded, stepping closer and opening the locket to reveal a tiny painted portrait of a woman with Hannah's same chestnut hair and gentle eyes. You favor her, Colton observed softly. So I've been told, Hannah said, a sad smile touching her lips as she closed the locket. She was the kindest person I've ever known. Colton wanted to ask about her father, about what had happened after her mother died, about what had driven her to flee west alone, but he held his questions. Instead, he said, she'd be proud of you making your own way like this. Hannah's eyes met his, surprise and something warmer flickering in their depths. Thank you, she whispered. I hope so. The moment stretched between them, intimate and charged with unspoken feelings, until the smell of stew threatening to boil over broke the spell. Hannah hurried to the stove, and Colton busied himself setting the table, both acutely aware of the shift that had occurred between them. That night, after Hannah had retired to the bedroom, Colton lay awake on his bedroll, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace. The cabin felt different with her, and it warmer, more alive. In just a few short weeks, she had transformed not just his home but his daily existence. He looked forward to returning each evening, to sharing meals and conversation, to simply being in her presence. It was dangerous territory, he knew. Hannah had made no secret of her intention to eventually move on, to make her own way in town. She was young, educated, and despite whatever trouble had driven her west, clearly capable of building a life for herself. What could he offer her but a hardscrabble existence on a small ranch that might never amount to much? Yet as sleep finally claimed him, Colton found himself hoping that eventually might be a long time coming. May brought warm days and cool nights, perfect weather for the garden to flourish under Hannah's care. Tender green shoots pushed through the soil, promising future harvests. The hens, responding to her regular attention, increased their egg production. Even the cabin itself seemed to brighten, as if the building had been waiting for a woman's touch all along. Hannah found herself settling into ranch life with surprising ease. The physical work, gardening, cooking, cleaning, helping with the smaller livestock left her pleasantly tired each evening, while the peaceful surroundings soothed the anxieties that had plagued her since leaving St. Louis. For the first time in years, she slept deeply and without nightmares. Colton, too, seemed to be flourishing with her presence. He smiled more readily, talked more freely, and took to bringing her small gifts from his rides around the property, interesting rocks, wildflowers, once a hummingbird's abandoned nest, perfect and delicate. They were the offerings of a man unaccustomed to courting, but trying in his own way to express growing affection. Neither of them spoke of these changes directly. The future remained a hazy concept, discussed only in terms of immediate plans: fence repairs, garden expansion, preserving food for winter. Yet the word "when" in relation to Hannah's departure gradually disappeared from their conversations, replaced by an unacknowledged "if" that hung in the air between them. Their careful dance of propriety continued, though increasingly strained by moments of accidental touch, hands brushing while passing dishes, shoulders touching as they worked side by side, once a steadying arm around her waist when Hannah nearly tripped on the porch steps. Each contact, however brief, sent sparks through Hannah that were both thrilling and terrifying. One afternoon in late May, Colton returned early from checking the northern pasture, riding hard into the yard with an urgency that sent Hannah hurrying onto the porch. "Storm coming," he called as he dismounted. "A bad one from the look of those clouds." Hannah followed his gaze to the western horizon, where dark clouds were building, ominous and towering. Even as she watched, lightning flickered within their depths. "What do we need to do?" she asked, practical despite the flutter of fear in her chest. "Get the animals secured and everything battened down," Colton replied, already leading his horse toward the barn. "It's going to be a gully washer." They worked quickly, Hannah helping to bring the chickens into their coop while Colton secured the horses in the barn. Together they checked that tools and loose items were stored away, that windows were latched, that the precious garden was as protected as possible from potential hail. By the time they finished, the storm was nearly upon them. The wind had picked up considerably, driving dust before it and causing Hannah's skirts to whip around her legs as they hurried back to the cabin. The first fat raindrops began to fall just as they reached the porch, and by the time they closed the door behind them, the sky had opened in a torrent. "Just in time," Colton said, removing his hat and shaking water from it. Hannah moved to the window, watching in awe as the rain came down in sheets, obscuring the view beyond the porch. Lightning cracked across the sky, followed almost immediately by a deafening boom of thunder that made her jump. "It's right on top of us," Colton observed, coming to stand beside her. "These spring storms can be fierce, but they usually pass quickly." Another lightning strike illuminated the yard, closer this time, the thunder following so quickly it seemed to shake the cabin's very foundation. Hannah gasped, instinctively stepping back from the window and directly into Colton's solid chest. His hands came up to steady her, resting lightly on her shoulders. "It's all right," he said softly, his breath warm against her hair. "We're safe in here." Hannah knew she should move away, maintain the careful distance they'd established. But she found herself rooted to the spot, acutely aware of his proximity, of the strength and warmth radiating from him. When another thunderclap shook the cabin, she turned instinctively within the circle of his arms, seeking comfort. Colton's arms tightened around her, one hand moving to stroke her hair soothingly. "I've got you," he murmured. "I've got you." Hannah looked up at him, intending to thank him for his reassurance, but the words died in her throat as she met his gaze. His eyes were dark with an emotion she recognized, because it mirrored her own desire, mingled with tenderness and uncertainty. Time seemed to slow as Colton lowered his head, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Instead, Hannah rose on her tiptoes, meeting him halfway as his lips found hers in a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened with weeks of unspoken longing. Hannah's arms wound around his neck as Colton pulled her closer, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other at her waist. The storm raged outside, but neither noticed, lost in a different kind of tempest, one that had been brewing between them since the day he carried her unconscious form into his home. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Colton rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted, his voice husky. "Why didn't you?" Hannah asked, her fingers playing with the hair at the nape of his neck. "I didn't want to presume," he said. "You came here by chance, not choice. I didn't want you to feel obligated." Hannah shook her head slightly. "I stayed by choice, Colton. I could have left for town weeks ago." He pulled back slightly to see her face better. "Why didn't you?" Hannah's smile was soft, vulnerable. "Because somewhere along the way, this place being here with you started feeling like home." The admission hung between them, weighty with implication. Colton's expression grew serious. "Hannah, I need to know something. Are you running from the law?" The question surprised her, but she understood its importance. "No," she answered truthfully. "Nothing like that. A husband." The word clearly pained him to ask. "No," Hannah said again. "I've never been married." Relief washed over Colton's features. "Then whatever it is you're running from, we can face it together if that's what you want." Hannah hesitated, knowing the moment had come to share the truth she'd been holding back. "I was engaged," she began slowly, "to the son of my father's business partner in St. Louis. It was arranged between our fathers when I was just 17, shortly after my mother died." Colton listened intently, his hand still resting lightly on her waist, grounding her. "At first I was compliant. My father insisted it was a good match, and after losing my mother, I wanted to please him. But as the wedding approached, I began to see Richard for who he truly was: controlling, cruel to those he considered beneath him." Hannah's voice faltered. "He began to show that side to me as well, once he believed I was securely his." Colton's hands tightened slightly on her waist, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. "My father died suddenly last winter, a heart attack. With him gone, Richard saw no reason to maintain pretenses. Hannah took a deep breath. "He struck me, for the first time, but not, I think, the last. That same night, I overheard him speaking with his father about my inheritance. They had plans to claim it all once we were married, then have me declared unstable and committed to an asylum." Colton's sharp intake of breath was the only indication of his anger. "So you ran," he said, understanding dawning. Hannah nodded. "I took what little cash I could access, some jewelry of my mother's that I sold along the way, and headed west. I had a distant cousin in California who I thought might take me in. But the money ran out in Albuquerque. My wagon broke down outside Flagstaff, and then a man who offered to help me repair it disappeared with what little I had left." She gave a humorless laugh. "By the time I reached your land, I had nothing left but determination." "And now," Colton asked, his voice gentle, "do you still plan to continue to California?" Hannah met his gaze steadily. "Not if I have a reason to stay." Something shifted in Colton's expression, hope mingling with hesitation. "I can't offer you much," he said honestly. "This ranch is modest at best. The work is hard, the rewards uncertain. There's no fine society here, no luxuries like you might have known in St. Louis." "I've had luxury without happiness," Hannah replied. "I'd rather have happiness without luxury." Colton searched her face, as if looking for any sign of doubt or reservation. Finding none, he pulled her close again, his kiss this time filled with promise rather than question. Outside, the storm began to abate, the thunder growing more distant, the rain softening to a steady patter on the roof. Neither Colton nor Hannah noticed. too absorbed in the realization that what had begun as a chance encounter her collapse from exhaustion on his land. His decision to carry her inside and care for her had somehow, against all odds, blossomed into love. As summer deepened, so did Hannah and Colton's relationship. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts, Hannah's garden producing abundantly, Colton's cattle herd growing with a successful calving season. They worked side by side during the day and spent evenings on the porch, watching the sunset and making plans for improvements to the property. Their sleeping arrangements remained proper, though the temptation to change that grew stronger with each passing day. Hannah continued to occupy the bedroom while Colton slept by the fire, a temporary solution until, as he put it one evening as they watched the stars come out, "We make things official." "Are you proposing, Mr. Forrester?" Hannah teased, though her heart raced at the implication. "Not yet," Colton replied, taking her hand in his. "When I do, I want to do it right, but I want you to know that's where my thoughts are heading." Hannah squeezed his hand, contentment washing over her. "Mine too," she admitted. June brought Colton's first trip into Jerome Junction since Hannah's arrival. They needed supplies they couldn't produce themselves, and he needed to check on cattle prices at the railhead. Though Hannah had initially planned to accompany him, a summer cold kept her at the ranch, much to Colton's evident relief. "People will talk if I bring you into town," he explained. "Not that I care what they say about me, but I don't want your reputation tarnished." Hannah understood his concern, though she chafed slightly at the constraints of propriety. Still, she waved him off with a list of necessities and a promise to rest while he was gone. Colton returned late that evening with supplies, news, and a small package wrapped in brown paper that he presented to Hannah with uncharacteristic nervousness. "What's this?" she asked, turning the parcel over in her hands. "Open it and see," Colton encouraged, watching her face intently. Inside was a book of poetry, Tennyson, a new edition with gilt-edged pages and a handsome leather binding. Hannah ran her fingers over the embossed cover in wonder. "Colton, it's beautiful," she breathed. "But it must have cost." "Don't worry about that," he interrupted. "The cattle prices are good this year. Besides, I noticed you reading my old copy until it practically fell apart. Thought you deserved a new one." Hannah rose on her tiptoes to kiss him, touched beyond words by the thoughtful gift. "Thank you," she said against his lips. "I shall treasure it." Colton's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer. "There's something else," he said when they parted, his expression growing serious. "News from back east that might concern you." Hannah tensed, fear flickering across her face. "What is it?" "The stagecoach brought newspapers," Colton explained. "There was an article about a St. Louis businessman named Richard Blackwell who died in a shooting outside a gambling hall." Hannah's hand flew to her mouth. "Richard is dead," Colton nodded, watching her carefully. "The article said he'd been gambling heavily, losing his family's fortune. Got into an argument over cards and was shot." Hannah sank into a chair, her mind whirling. The man who had terrorized her, driven her to flee everything she knew, was gone. She should feel relief, perhaps even satisfaction, but instead found herself experiencing a complex mix of emotions: shock, pity for the waste of a life, and overwhelming gratitude that the specter of his pursuit had vanished. "Are you all right?" Colton asked, kneeling beside her chair and taking her hands in his. "Yes," Hannah said after a moment, meeting his concerned gaze. "It's just unexpected. I never wished him dead, despite everything. But I can't deny feeling relieved that I no longer need to look over my shoulder." Colton nodded, understanding. "It changes things for you," he observed. "You could go back to St. Louis now, claim your inheritance, rebuild your life there." The suggestion hung in the air between them, an unwelcome reminder that their relationship had begun under extraordinary circumstances. Now that the threat keeping Hannah in hiding was gone, did she still have reason to stay? Hannah reached out to touch Colton's face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "My life is here now," she said softly but firmly. "With you if you'll have me." The tension in Colton's shoulders eased visibly. "There's nothing I want more," he assured her, turning his head to press a kiss to her palm. The next morning, Colton rose before dawn as usual, but didn't immediately head out to his chores. Instead, Hannah found him sitting at the kitchen table, a serious expression on his face and a small object in his hand. "Colton, is everything all right?" she asked, tying her apron around her waist. He stood, clearing his throat nervously. "There's something I need to ask you, and after yesterday's news, it seemed like the right time." Hannah's heart began to race as Colton took her hands in his. "Hannah Dawson, I know we haven't known each other long in the usual way of things, but I feel like I've known you forever." He took a deep breath. "I love you. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you opened your eyes in my bed and asked for water." Hannah's eyes filled with tears as Colton continued, his voice growing steadier with each word. "I want to build a life with you right here on this land. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep next to you every night. I want to see your garden grow and maybe someday watch our children play in it." He opened his hand to reveal a ring simple but lovely, a small pearl set in gold. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I've been carrying it since the war, waiting for the right woman to give it to." Dropping to one knee, Colton looked up at Hannah with such love and hope that her heart felt too full for her chest. "Hannah Dawson, will you marry me?" "Yes," Hannah whispered, then more loudly. "Yes, Colton Forrester, I will marry you." Colton's face broke into a radiant smile as he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her all along. He rose and gathered her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his enthusiasm and spinning her around the kitchen, both of them laughing with joy. When he set her down, Hannah asked the practical question. "When shall we be married?" "As soon as possible," Colton replied without hesitation. "There's a circuit preacher who comes through Jerome Junction every few weeks. I'll ride into town today and find out when he's due next." Hannah nodded, though a shadow crossed her face. "Colton, I should tell you. My inheritance. If I were to try to claim it, it would mean returning to St. Louis, engaging lawyers facing Richard's family. Even with him gone, they might fight me." Colton's expression was serious as he considered this. "Is it important to you? The inheritance?" Hannah shook her head slowly. "The money itself, no. But it was my mother's family fortune, meant to come to me. It feels wrong to simply abandon it." "Then we won't," Colton decided. "After we're married, if you want, we can write to a lawyer in St. Louis. Start the process properly, with no need for you to return there unless absolutely necessary." He squeezed her hands. "But Hannah, I need you to know I'm not marrying you for any fortune. If it never materializes, I'll still count myself the luckiest man in Arizona territory." Hannah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "And I'll still be the luckiest woman." The circuit preacher, as it happened, was due in Jerome Junction the following Sunday. The town, Colton explained after his visit, was a growing settlement that had sprung up around the railroad junction, now boasting a general store, a small hotel, 2 saloons, and a handful of other businesses. It hosted church services whenever the preacher came through, using the hotel's dining room as an improvised chapel. Hannah spent the days leading up to the wedding in a flurry of preparation. She used fabric Colton had purchased in town to make herself a new dress, not white, which seemed impractical for their circumstances, but a soft blue that brought out the color of her eyes. She cleaned the cabin until it gleamed, prepared special foods that could be enjoyed upon their return, and tried to calm the butterflies that took up permanent residence in her stomach. For his part, Colton worked from dawn until dusk, determined to have all the pressing ranch chores completed so they could have a few days of relative leisure after the wedding. He also made a few improvements to the cabin that he'd been planning for months, but had never found time to implement a larger window to let in more light, shelves for Hannah's growing collection of preserved foods, a second rocking chair for the porch so they could sit side by side in the evenings. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright. Hannah awoke early, too excited and nervous to sleep any longer. This was to be her last morning waking alone in this bed, a thought that sent both thrills and tremors through her. Colton had arranged for them to stay the night at the hotel in Jerome Junction after the wedding, a luxury that represented a significant expense for him, but one he insisted upon. A proper wedding night, he'd said, his eyes darkening with promise in a way that made Hannah blush to the roots of her hair. They rode into town together. Hannah perched somewhat awkwardly side-saddle on a gentle mare Colton had been training. Her wedding dress and a change of clothes were carefully packed in saddlebags, along with the few personal items she would need for their overnight stay. Jerome Junction proved to be larger than Hannah had imagined, though still small by the standards of cities back east. The railroad had brought prosperity, evident in the substantial buildings lining the main street and the bustle of activity around the station. People looked at them curiously as they rode past. Newcomers were always objects of interest in small western towns, and a woman even more so. They stopped first at the general store, where Colton introduced Hannah to the proprietor, a jovial man named Frank Wilson who pumped her hand enthusiastically. "So you're the young lady who's managed to rope our confirmed bachelor," he exclaimed. "The whole town's been curious since Colton here started buying women's things and refused to explain why." Hannah blushed but smiled warmly. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Wilson." "Frank, please," the storekeeper insisted. Any woman brave enough to take on Colton Forrester and his ramshackle ranch is first name worthy in my book. Colton rolled his eyes good-naturedly. "Don't listen to him, Hannah. Frank here has been trying to sell me that piece of rocky hillside he calls prime real estate for years. He's just sore I'm smarter than to buy it." Frank laughed heartily. "Can't blame a man for trying." He turned back to Hannah. "In all seriousness, my dear, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our little community. We don't get many refined ladies out this way." Hannah thanked him, touched by the genuine welcome. As they left the store, Colton explained that Frank and his wife Sarah were among the first settlers in Jerome Junction and had become unofficial town leaders. "They're good people," he said. "Sarah runs the town's lending library out of the back room of the store, just a shelf of books people share, but it's something. She'll be pleased to meet you once she hears you're a reader." Their next stop was the hotel, a two-story building with a wide porch across the front. The owner, a widow named Mrs. Carpenter, showed them to the room Colton had reserved the best in the establishment, with a real brass bed and lace curtains at the window. "For after the ceremony," she explained with a knowing smile that made Hannah blush again. "You can change here before the service if you'd like, dear. We've arranged for it to begin at noon." Left alone to prepare, Hannah unpacked her wedding dress and laid it carefully across the bed. The blue fabric, a soft chambray Colton had purchased in town, had been transformed by her skilled hands into a simple but elegant gown with a fitted bodice and flowing skirt. It wasn't the elaborate creation she might have worn for a society wedding in St. Louis, but Hannah found she preferred it practical yet pretty, like the life she was choosing. She washed her face and hands in the basin provided, then brushed out her long chestnut hair. After consideration, she decided to wear it mostly down, the way Colton had once mentioned he liked it, with just the front sections pulled back and secured with combs. Around her neck, she fastened her mother's locket, something old and borrowed. Her dress was new, and for something blue. Well, the dress itself fulfilled that requirement. Hannah was just putting the finishing touches on her appearance when a knock came at the door. Thinking it might be Colton, she called, "Just a moment." But the voice that answered was female and unfamiliar. "It's Sarah Wilson, dear, Frank's wife. I thought you might like some company before the ceremony." Hannah opened the door to find a plump, cheerful woman with silver-streaked dark hair and kind eyes. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers tied with ribbon. "Oh my," Sarah said, looking Hannah up and down. "Aren't you a picture? Colton's a fortunate man indeed." "Thank you," Hannah said, genuinely touched. "Please come in." Sarah entered, handing Hannah the bouquet. "Just a little something for you to carry. We don't stand on much ceremony out here, but every bride deserves flowers on her wedding day." Hannah buried her nose in the colorful blooms, breathing in their sweet scent. "They're beautiful. Thank you so much." "It's nothing, dear," Sarah said, waving away the thanks. "Now, is there anything you need, any questions about what to expect?" The older woman's expression made it clear she wasn't referring solely to the wedding ceremony. Hannah felt heat rise in her cheeks again. That is." Sarah patted her hand reassuringly. "Never you mind. I can see you're a sensible girl. Just remember that love makes everything easier, and communication is essential in all aspects of marriage." She winked, causing Hannah to flush deeper. "Now, shall we go downstairs? I believe your groom is waiting, and if the way he talks about you is any indication, he's not a patient man today." Hannah took a deep breath, smoothed her skirts one last time, and nodded. "I'm ready." The hotel dining room had been transformed as much as possible into a chapel setting. Tables had been pushed to the sides, chairs arranged in rows, and someone had placed vases of wildflowers similar to Hannah's bouquet around the room. At the far end stood the preacher, a weathered man in a black coat, with Colton beside him. Hannah's breath caught at the sight of her soon-to-be husband. Colton had clearly made an effort with his appearance. His usually unruly dark hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. He wore a clean white shirt, black trousers, and a black string tie, formal attire by ranch standards. But it was his expression that truly captured her heart, a mixture of awe, adoration, and barely contained joy as he watched her walk toward him. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. The preacher, Reverend Thomas, spoke of the sanctity of marriage, the commitment they were making before God and this community, and the importance of supporting each other through life's joys and trials. Hannah and Colton exchanged simple vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other for as long as they both should live. When Colton slipped a gold band onto Hannah's finger to join her engagement ring, another surprise, he'd somehow managed to arrange without her knowledge. His hands trembled slightly. Hannah, in turn, placed a matching band on his finger, the metal warm from being carried close to her heart. "By the authority vested in me," Reverend Thomas proclaimed, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Colton drew Hannah into his arms with reverent care, as if she were made of the finest porcelain. His kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, the small gathering of townspeople who had come to witness the ceremony broke into applause and cheers. "May I present Mr. and Mrs. Colton Forrester," the preacher announced, and Hannah felt a swell of emotion at hearing herself called by her new name for the first time. What followed was a surprisingly festive celebration. The hotel had prepared a special meal, the townspeople brought additional dishes to share, and someone produced a fiddle, filling the room with lively music. Hannah found herself whirling from one introduction to another as Colton proudly presented his bride to everyone present. "You've caused quite a stir," he murmured in her ear during a rare moment alone. "Half the men in town are questioning their bachelor status now, and the other half are openly envious." Hannah laughed, leaning into his solid warmth. "And how do you feel, Mr. Forrester?" Colton's arm tightened around her waist. "Like the luckiest man in the Arizona Territory," he replied, his voice husky with emotion. "And like I can't wait to get you alone, Mrs. Forrester." Hannah felt heat rise to her face yet again, but this time it was accompanied by a pleasant flutter of anticipation low in her belly. "Then perhaps we should make our excuses soon," she suggested boldly. Colton's eyes darkened at her words. "Perhaps we should." They managed to slip away from the celebration as the afternoon waned, amid knowing looks and good-natured teasing from their newfound friends. Back in their hotel room, with the door firmly closed behind them, Hannah suddenly felt shy, acutely aware of the shift in their relationship. Colton seemed to sense her nervousness. Instead of rushing to claim his husbandly rights, he crossed to the window and drew the curtains, then lit the lamp on the bedside table, adjusting it to cast a soft, warm glow throughout the room. "We have all the time in the world, Hannah," he said gently. "There's no hurry." Grateful for his understanding, Hannah moved to stand before him, reaching up to touch his face. "I love you, Colton Forrester," she whispered. His eyes softened as he caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "And I love you, Hannah Forrester. More than I ever thought possible." Their kiss began tenderly but quickly deepened, months of restrained desire finally finding release. Colton's hands were gentle as he helped Hannah out of her wedding dress, his breath catching as more of her was revealed to him. Hannah, in turn, unbuttoned his shirt with trembling fingers, marveling at the strong planes of his chest beneath her palms. What followed was a sweet discovery of each other, sometimes awkward, sometimes breathtakingly perfect, but always filled with love and wonder. Colton proved to be as considerate and patient a lover as he was a man, guiding Hannah through her first experience of physical love with tenderness and care. Afterward, as they lay tangled in the sheets, Hannah's head resting on Colton's chest, he traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder and murmured, "Welcome home, Mrs. Forrester." And Hannah, listening to the steady beat of her husband's heart beneath her ear, knew that home had nothing to do with places or possessions. Home was here, in Colton's arms, in the life they would build together, a life that had begun the moment she collapsed from exhaustion on his land. And he carried her inside, never to ask her to leave. The return to the ranch the following afternoon was a homecoming in the truest sense. As they crested the final rise and the cabin came into view, nestled among the cottonwoods with smoke curling from its chimney, Frank Wilson had arranged for one of the town boys to ride out and light a fire for their return. Hannah felt a surge of belonging unlike anything she'd experienced before. "What do you think, Mrs. Forrester?" Colton asked, his arm tightening around her waist as they rode double on his horse. "Does it look different now that it's officially your home too?" Hannah considered the question seriously. "It looks the same," she decided, "but I see it differently. Before, it was a haven somewhere safe when I had nowhere else to go. Now it's the beginning of our story together." Colton pressed a kiss to her temple. "I like that way of thinking about it." They settled quickly into married life, their previous routine adjusted to reflect their new relationship. No longer did Colton sleep by the fire while Hannah took the bedroom. Now they shared the bed, finding in each other's arms comfort and passion in equal measure. During the day, they worked side by side when possible, Hannah in the garden or kitchen, Colton with the livestock and fields, and apart when necessary, always coming together at mealtimes to share the events of their day. In the evenings, they often sat on the porch watching the sunset, sometimes reading aloud from Hannah's books, sometimes simply enjoying the peaceful silence of the ranch at day's end. News from St. Louis arrived in late summer, in the form of a letter from the lawyer Hannah had written to regarding her inheritance. The news was mixed. Richard's family was indeed contesting her claim, arguing that she had abandoned her fiancé and therefore had no right to what they considered family property. However, the lawyer seemed confident that Hannah's position was legally sound, especially as she was now respectably married and could prove she had fled due to threats against her person. "It will take time," Hannah told Colton as they discussed the letter over dinner. "Possibly years. And I may need to travel to St. Louis eventually to testify." Colton nodded thoughtfully. "When the time comes, we'll go together," he promised. "I won't have you facing those people alone." Hannah reached across the table to squeeze his hand, grateful for his unwavering support. "It's strange," she mused. "A few months ago, that inheritance seemed like my only hope for independence. Now, Colton prompted when she trailed off. Hannah smiled. "Now I realize I've found something far more valuable than money. If we never see a penny of that inheritance, I'll still count myself fortunate beyond measure." Colton brought her hand to his lips. "That said," he added practically, "if it is rightfully yours, we'll fight for it. That land could mean security for our future, for any children we might have." The mention of children brought a soft flush to Hannah's cheeks. They had spoken of having a family, of course, but always as a someday possibility. Little did Colton know that Hannah had begun to suspect that someday might be arriving sooner than they'd planned. Fall brought the cattle roundup, a busy time when Colton worked from dawn until well after dusk, gathering the herd, separating out the animals to be sold, and driving them to the railhead at Jerome Junction. Hannah threw herself into preparations, cooking meals that could be eaten quickly or carried into the field, mending clothing, and keeping the home fires burning literally and figuratively during her husband's long absences. It was during this busy season that Hannah's suspicions about her condition were confirmed. The persistent morning sickness, the tenderness in her breasts, the subtle changes in her body all pointed to one joyous conclusion: she was with child. Their child conceived in love, a tangible symbol of the life they were building together. She decided to keep the news to herself until after the roundup was complete. Colton had enough on his mind without the added distraction of impending fatherhood. Besides, Hannah wanted to tell him in a special way when they had time to truly celebrate. The opportunity came in early November, after the last of the cattle had been sold and Colton had returned home with pockets full of cash and plans for ranch improvements. Hannah prepared his favorite meal, venison stew with dumplings, fresh bread, and apple pie, and set the table with their best dishes and the single bottle of wine they'd been saving for a special occasion. Colton raised an eyebrow at the elaborate preparations. "What's all this?" he asked, coming in from washing up to find Hannah lighting candles. "A celebration," she replied with a mysterious smile. "For the successful roundup and for other news." His curiosity piqued, Colton took his seat at the table, watching as Hannah served the meal with particular care. They ate with enjoyment, discussing how the cattle sales had gone and what the coming winter might bring. Only when the plates were cleared and they were sharing the apple pie did Hannah finally broach the subject that had been foremost in her mind. "Colton," she began, suddenly nervous despite her planning. "Do you remember when we spoke of our future, of the family we might have someday?" He nodded, setting down his fork. "Of course." Hannah took a deep breath, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "It seems someday is coming sooner than we thought. I'm going to have a baby in late spring, I think." For a moment, Colton simply stared at her, his expression blank with shock. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face, a smile of such radiant joy that Hannah felt tears spring to her eyes in response. "A baby," he repeated, as if testing the word. "Our baby." Hannah nodded, her own smile tremulous with emotion. "Are you happy?" In answer, Colton rose from his chair and came around the table, pulling Hannah gently to her feet and into his arms. "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," he murmured against her hair. "Overjoyed, blessed, terrified." He pulled back to look into her eyes. "Are you well? Is everything?" "Proceeding as it should," Hannah nodded reassuringly. "As far as I can tell. I've been a bit sick in the mornings, but that's normal and it seems to be easing now." Colton's hand moved to cover hers where it rested on her abdomen. "Our child," he said wonderingly, "growing right here." The tenderness in his voice, the reverence with which he touched her, made Hannah's heart swell with love. This man, this kind, strong, gentle man who had found her collapsed from exhaustion on his land and carried her inside without question, was going to be the father of her child. Their child. The first, she hoped, of many. "I love you, Colton Forrester," she whispered, rising on her tiptoes to kiss him. "And I love you, Hannah Forrester," he replied against her lips. "You and our little one both." Winter settled over the ranch, bringing shorter days and long, cozy evenings by the fire. The cabin, which had seemed perfectly adequate for two people, suddenly felt small as Colton threw himself into preparations for the baby's arrival. He built a cradle, working on it in the evenings while Hannah sewed tiny garments, and began planning an addition to the house, a proper nursery that could eventually become a bedroom as their child grew. "We'll need more space if we're to have more children," he explained as he showed Hannah his drawings. "I'm thinking 2 extra rooms now, with the possibility of adding more later." Hannah, her hand resting on her growing belly, laughed at his enthusiasm. "Perhaps we should see how we manage with this one before planning for a brood." But secretly, she loved his eagerness, his absolute certainty that their future would include a large, loving family. It was a far cry from the lonely existence she had anticipated when fleeing St. Louis, or even from the modest hopes she'd harbored when first agreeing to stay on at the ranch. Christmas came, bringing with it a blanket of snow that transformed the landscape into a wonderland of white. Unable to travel to Jerome Junction due to Hannah's condition and the weather, they celebrated quietly at home, exchanging simple gifts and sharing memories of holidays past. "Next Christmas will be different," Hannah observed as they sat before the fire, her head resting on Colton's shoulder. "We'll have a little one to celebrate with." Colton's hand came to rest on her rounded abdomen, where their child had recently begun to make its presence known with fluttering movements. "I can hardly wait," he admitted, "though I'm enjoying this quiet time with just you as well." Hannah turned her face up for his kiss, marveling at how thoroughly happy she was despite the simplicity of their circumstances. The grand houses and elaborate social events of her St. Louis life seemed like a distant dream, far less substantial than the solid reality of Colton's arms around her and the child growing beneath her heart. Spring came early to the Arizona territory, bringing with it wildflowers, new calves, and the final weeks of Hannah's pregnancy. The addition to the cabin was completed just in time, 2 new rooms extending from the back, with real glass windows and proper wooden floors. Hannah set about making the nursery as welcoming as possible, hanging curtains she'd sewn from fabric bought in town and arranging the cradle Colton had crafted with such care. In late April, just as the garden was beginning to sprout, Hannah went into labor. It was a long, difficult process, with Colton alternating between calm support and barely concealed panic. Mrs. Wilson from town had come to assist, her experience with births a welcome presence in the small cabin. "You're doing wonderfully, dear," the older woman assured Hannah as another contraction gripped her. "Not much longer now." Colton, relegated to boiling water and providing clean cloths, paced anxiously in the main room, wincing at each of Hannah's cries. When Sarah finally called for him to come in, he almost tripped in his haste to reach his wife's side. The sight that greeted him would remain etched in his memory forever. Hannah, exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle against her breast. "Colton," she said, her voice weak but joyful, "come meet your son." With trembling hands, Colton accepted the swaddled infant from his wife. The baby was small and red-faced, with a shock of dark hair that promised to be as unruly as his father's. As Colton watched in wonder, the tiny boy opened his eyes blue like all newborns, but with a shape that reminded him of Hannah. "Hello, little one," Colton whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Welcome to the world." They named him James, after Hannah's father, a peace offering to the memory of a man who had loved her in his way, even if he had made mistakes in his final years. James Colton Forrester, born on a spring morning in 1881, heir to a modest cattle ranch and whatever might come from his mother's contested inheritance, but more importantly, heir to the love story that had begun with an act of simple kindness, a collapsed woman, carried inside by a lonely cowboy who never asked her to leave. As summer bloomed across the Arizona territory, life settled into a new rhythm centered around the infant's needs. Hannah, recovering her strength quickly, managed to maintain the garden while caring for James. Colton, besotted with his son, took to carrying the baby with him during chores around the ranch, narrating everything he did as if the infant could understand. "Your daddy is a little crazy," Hannah told James as she nursed him one evening, watching through the window as Colton worked on reinforcing the corral fence. "But there's no better man in all the territory, and you're lucky to have him." James blinked up at her with eyes that were beginning to shift from newborn blue to a hazel that matched her own, his tiny hand curling around her finger with surprising strength. Hannah's heart swelled with love for this miracle they had created, this perfect blend of herself and the man she adored. In August, another letter arrived from the lawyer in St. Louis. The case regarding Hannah's inheritance was progressing, with the courts leaning in her favor due to evidence of Richard Blackwell's abusive behavior and financial misdealing that had come to light after his death. If all continued as expected, Hannah might need to travel to St. Louis the following spring to finalize matters. "We could make a family trip of it," Colton suggested as they discussed the letter that evening. "Show James the Mississippi River, visit your mother's grave if you'd like." Hannah considered this, rocking gently in her chair with the sleeping baby in her arms. "I would like that," she decided. "To say a proper goodbye to that part of my life, and to show my son where his roots began, even if his future lies here." Colton nodded, understanding as always. "Then we'll plan for it. The inheritance would allow us to expand the ranch considerably, better breeding stock, maybe hire some help." Hannah smiled at her husband's practical thinking. "Always planning for the future, aren't you?" "Our future," Colton corrected, his expression softening as he gazed at her and their child. "The one that began the moment you collapsed on my land and I carried you inside. And never asked me to leave," Hannah finished softly. Best decision I ever made, Colton affirmed, rising to kneel beside her chair and press a gentle kiss first to his son's downy head, then to his wife's lips. Even if I didn't know then what I was starting. Hannah leaned into his kiss, her free hand coming up to caress his cheek. I think perhaps a part of you did know, she murmured. Just as a part of me knew, even in my exhaustion and fear, that I had finally found my way home. Outside, the sun sank toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. They worked together, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. Inside, the small family forged by chance, cemented by choice, blessed by love held each other close, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, just as they had from the very beginning. And in the years that followed, years that brought 3 more children, the successful claim of Hannah's inheritance, expansion of the ranch into one of the most prosperous in the territory, and all the everyday joys and sorrows that make up a shared life, neither Colton nor Hannah ever regretted the twist of fate that had brought them together. For in finding each other, they had found not just love, but home, the truest home either had ever known. From time to time, visitors to the Forrester ranch would ask how such an unlikely pair had met the educated Eastern lady and the rough-hewn Western rancher. Colton would smile at Hannah, his eyes still carrying that same look of wonder after all their years together, and begin the tale. Well, you see, she collapsed from exhaustion on my land. I carried her inside. And Hannah would finish with a soft smile, and he never asked me to leave. It was a simple story, told without embellishment, yet containing within it all the elements that had shaped their lives. Compassion, courage, second chances, and most of all, love, a love born in the wild heart of the Arizona territory, nurtured through hardship and joy alike, and destined to endure as steadfastly as the land itself.